Just how fast is Luffy, really? In this video, I'll be scaling his speed with as little bias as possible, using what I call the best bare minimum approach. That means I'll dive into all purely canon sources, like the manga, the anime, and direct author statements, and find Luffy's best confirmed feats. Then I'll scale those feats down to their most conservative, reliable minimums. Now, let's start with Luffy's earliest relevant speed feats, beginning in the Skypiea arc. There are a few major moments worth breaking down. First, during their encounter with Enel, both Nami and Usopp were able to dodge his lightning strikes from very close range. Real-world lightning travels at around Mach 300 or more, meaning even the two weakest members of the crew showed massively hypersonic reaction and combat speeds at that point. Second, despite dodging lightning, Usopp was completely helpless against Enel's physical attacks. That tells us Enel's physical strikes were significantly faster than Mach 300. Third, there are some key details we need to factor in. 1. Enel wasn't taking Nami or Usopp seriously. So all of that speed, that was casual. 2. Enel had base-level observation haki, which, similar to the Sharingan, lets him predict movements. For consistency's sake, I'll assume he wasn't using haki against Nami and Usopp because they posed no threat. But against Luffy, he was going all out. Lightning plus observation haki. At first, it overwhelmed Luffy, until he started fighting with what he called his instinct. That instinct was actually his observation haki beginning to awaken. So, let's wrap this up in a neat little bow. Nami and Usopp dodged Enel's lightning casually, which already puts them around Mach 300 plus. Against Luffy, Enel cranked things up with haki and full power. But even then, a fatigued and injured Luffy kept up while dragging around a giant golden ball. That ball, it weighed in at a minimum of 17,000 pounds. Taking all of this into account, both Luffy and Enel should be sitting comfortably in the low to mid, massively hypersonic plus range, with potential peaks at the high end of that tier. If I had to throw out a number, I'd estimate Luffy's speed here falls between Mach 1,500 and Mach 8,000. The next step in Luffy's journey brings us to the Long Ring, Long Land arc, an arc surrounded by a fair bit of controversy. There are two things worth discussing here, starting with the most debated, whether or not Foxy's photon attack is actually light speed. Now, there are really only two main counterarguments people use to deny the light speed claim. First, Foxy says the attack is based on a new type of atom, so the term photon could just be for show. Second, since the attack slows its target, some assume it must not travel that fast in the first place. But both of these theories have issues. Let's start with the first one. What we actually see Luffy dodging isn't the so-called new atom itself, but rather the radiation it emits. And there are many types of radiation, like gamma rays and actual photons, that do travel at the speed of light. As for the second point, Foxy's ability slows down whatever it hits, not the speed at which the beam travels. That's a big distinction. This is further supported by the fact that his attacks reflect off of mirrors, which is something only light-based attacks can realistically do. It seems Oda was being fairly intentional here. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute. If Luffy was only clocking in at around Mach 8,000 just a few chapters ago, how is he suddenly reacting to light-speed attacks without any training? And that's a fair question, but there are two possible explanations. The first, and less likely, is that Enel's lightning and observation haki were way more powerful than originally assumed. Remember, his devil fruit lets him extend the range of his haki, so maybe it also enhances its clarity. And since lightning emits light, it's possible Luffy was already reacting to light indirectly through that. But the more likely explanation: this is an early example of Luffy's reality warping powers. At the start of the arc, Luffy becomes fully convinced that wearing the afro will make him stronger. And because his devil fruit allows his imagination to shape reality, even if he doesn't realize it, this might have been a subconscious, small-scale use of that ability. Not enough to drastically boost his stats, but enough to explain this one anomaly. So, no. I wouldn't say his power level took a massive jump after this arc. He still doesn't consciously know he can do these things, but I would argue that the experience pushed him further. At minimum, it likely brought him closer to the upper end of massively hypersonic plus, and possibly even into the low sub-relativistic range, especially now that he's had to deal with something as fast as actual light. Now we move on to the Water 7 and Inie's Lobby arc, where things start to get much, much faster. Getting straight to the point, after CP9 arrives to take Robin, Luffy goes after them to get her back. During this confrontation, he has his first real clash with Rob Lucci, and at that moment, Rob Lucci is so fast that Luffy can't even see him. Now, if we estimate that Luffy was approaching the top of the massively hypersonic plus tier by this point, then that means base form Rob Lucci, before tapping into his devil fruit powers, was already operating at sub-relativistic speeds. I can't say for certain how deep into sub-relativistic that would place him, but based on what we've gathered, ChatGPT estimates his speed to be somewhere around Mach 30,000, which would put him near the upper end of that tier. And that's just the beginning. Moving into Enies Lobby, this is where Luffy first unleashes Gear Second, marking a major leap in both his speed and strength. The boost is so dramatic that he goes from being unable to track Rob Lucci to fighting him on equal footing, even after Lucci transforms with his devil fruit. After rewatching the fight closely, I'd confidently say that transformed Lucci still held the speed advantage, while Luffy had the upper hand in raw power. That's why Luffy had to combine both Gear Second and Gear Third just to keep up and ultimately secure the win. Taking all of that into account, their battle was likely taking place at a bare minimum of sub-relativistic plus speeds. Now, one more important point to consider. I haven't factored in the possibility of Rob Lucci using observation haki during that fight. While it wasn't outright stated or shown, it's something that very likely existed, even if just at a basic level. And if Lucci did have solid observation haki at the time, that could easily push this fight into the relativistic to relativistic plus range. Next up is Thriller Bark, and oh boy, the controversy here runs deep. If you've been around the community, you probably already guessed what we're diving into: Kuma's pad cannon attack and whether or not it's actually light speed. Now, this moment has more controversy surrounding it than Mr. Beast, so let's start by fairly addressing the most common arguments against the light speed claim. Then I'll explain why I don't think they hold up. Argument 1. It can't be light speed because the databook says only highly advanced observation haki users can dodge light speed attacks. To that I say, please, for the love of all things canon, only use manga, anime, or confirmed author statements when debating power scaling. Databooks are notoriously inconsistent. For example, one got Zunasha's height completely wrong for years, proving they're not always reliable. But even if we entertain that argument for a moment, two things come to mind. First, what does proficient haki user even mean? Every human in the One Piece world technically has haki potential, so even pre-time Skip Luffy could arguably be more proficient than most. Second, the databook may not be referring strictly to the speed of a single beam. It could also be referring to how many beams are being fired at once. Dodging one light beam is already impressive. Dodging 10 fired at different angles simultaneously, especially by someone like Kizaru, who has his own observation haki, becomes exponentially harder. So the databook statement doesn't disprove anything. It just adds context to how hard it is to dodge light speed attacks in complex scenarios, not whether light speed feats are possible without top-tier haki. Argument 2. It just doesn't make sense for characters to be that fast this early in the story. And honestly, that's a fair concern, especially considering how we just scaled Luffy to around Mach 8,000 a few arcs ago. But here's the issue. Every calculation I made earlier was done by taking things at face value. I intentionally kept assumptions conservative. Take Enel, for example. He had a dangerous combo of lightning powers and observation haki, but I only scaled him to standard lightning speed, with a slight boost from haki. But the truth is, Devil Fruit users aren't bound by the natural limitations of their elements. This was proven by a Kainu, whose magma burns hotter than fire, despite real magma being cooler than flames. So why couldn't Enel's lightning be significantly faster than the real-world version? And why couldn't his haki have made a much bigger difference than I gave credit for? It actually does make sense once you open up to that perspective. Argument 3, the best one I've heard. Kuma's attacks are just the shock waves from air being repelled at light speed, not the air bubbles themselves moving that fast. Now this is where things get interesting. To break this down properly, we need to revisit the source. In Chapter 484, Kuma compresses air into small bubbles and launches them like bullets or bombs. One of them even detonates with a massive shock wave that engulfs the entire area. Now, here's the key. Kuma explicitly states that his paws repel air at the speed of light, and that this repelled air creates shock waves capable of piercing anything. Meanwhile, Zoro is shown dodging these air bubbles, and multiple characters around him confirm that the bubbles themselves, not just the shock waves, are made of compressed air. That's huge. So what's happening? Think of it like a bullet fired from a gun. The bullet travels faster than sound, and as it moves, it creates a sonic boom, a pressure wave that radiates from the bullet's path. In Kuma's case, the air bubbles are the bullets, moving at light speed, which is massively faster than sound. As they travel, they create continuous shock waves, like giant, concentrated sonic booms. And when those bubbles pop on contact, they release all the compressed air at once, causing localized explosions, just like the massive detonation we saw at the end of the chapter. So, either way you look at it, Zoro is dodging projectiles that are at or near the speed of light. That would make Zoro faster than light in this moment, even while fatigued. Which means Luffy, who was clearly faster than Zoro at this point, would have to be even faster. To keep things conservative, I'd scale Zoro to about 1.5 to 2 times light speed, given his weakened state. And Luffy, with Gear Second activated, he'd be comfortably operating at 3 to 4 times faster than light during Thriller Bark. So, yes, when you look at the mechanics, the source material, and how devil fruits bend natural laws, the light speed feat does make sense, and it just might be one of the earliest major speed spikes in the series. Now, after Thriller Bark, the next 3 arcs don't really introduce any major new speed feats, but they do mark an important turning point. This is when the Straw Hats start dealing with actual light-based attacks. And while we're on the topic, let me clear up a bit of confusion, because I know how heated some of these debates can get. Yes, it took all of the Straw Hats to bring down one pacifista. No, that doesn't debunk any of their earlier speed scaling. The pacifista wasn't hard to hit, it was just insanely durable. Every crew member was landing clean hits, they just didn't have the raw power to do serious damage at the time. And yes, they were effortlessly taken out by Kuma afterward. But keep in mind, they were already tired and injured, and Kuma is almost certainly faster than Light himself, especially considering what we've seen from his attacks. So no, none of that undermines the speed feats we've already covered, just something to keep in mind before jumping into the comments. Alright, now we're on to the Return to Sabaody arc. In this arc, Luffy comes face to face with a pacifista once again, but this time he's packing 2 full years of intense, focused training under his belt. And that training shows immediately. The pacifista fires 3 light beams at Luffy, and both the anime and the manga make it abundantly clear. Those beams look painfully slow to him now. The anime in particular emphasizes it even more by showing Luffy calmly, standing up, waiting, and only dodging at the very last second, as if he couldn't be bothered until the beams were right in front of him. After doing a bit of digging and analyzing the scene, I'd estimate that base form Luffy, fresh out of the time skip, is operating at anywhere from 4 to 10 times faster than Light. For the sake of consistency and conservative scaling, I'll go with 5x FTL as the bare minimum. It'll make future comparisons cleaner. Now, let's scale that up. Gear. Second at this point would likely push Luffy to anywhere between 8x and 20x faster than Light. Gear fourth. Snake Man would naturally scale even higher. I'm not entirely sure how much faster, but to keep things grounded, let's say a minimum of 15x FTL and a possible maximum of 30x. Either way, this arc marks a massive speed jump for Luffy, and it only gets crazier from here. After return to Sabaody, the next arcs are Fishman Island and Punk Hazard. But in terms of speed scaling, there really isn't much to work with. No significant feats, no major speed comparisons, so we're going to skip ahead to Dressrosa. In his fight against Doflamingo, Luffy actually struggles to make much of an impact, even while using Gear Second. That tells us one important thing. Doflamingo was at least as fast as Gear Second Luffy at the time, possibly even a bit faster. So, for scaling purposes, we can comfortably place Doflamingo at around 10x faster than Light. But once Luffy activates Gear 4th, Bound Man, everything changes. He's suddenly able to speed blitz Doflamingo, and to pull off a true speed blitz, you typically need to be at least 3 times faster than your opponent. That would put Gear 4th Luffy during Dressrosa at roughly 30x faster than Light, give or take. A massive leap, and just the beginning of what's to come. Now we move on to the arc that gives Luffy one of his biggest speed boosts yet, Whole Cake Island. I'll skip the fluff and get straight to the point. During his fight with Katakuri, Luffy initially used the same form he used to defeat Doflamingo, Gear 4th, Bound Man. But this time, it wasn't enough. Bound Man was too slow and too weak to keep up with Katakuri's overwhelming advantage, Future Sight. This ability forced Luffy into one of the most intense learning curves in the series, awakening his own Future Sight in the middle of battle. Once he unlocked it, Luffy was finally able to keep up with Katakuri's speed, even in base form. So let's follow a simple line of logic. Katakuri is clearly faster than Bound Man, but not so fast that Luffy couldn't touch him. To completely speed blitz someone, you usually need to be 3 times faster than them. That puts Katakuri's speed somewhere in the range of 60 to 80 times the speed of Light. After awakening Future Sight, base form Luffy was able to hold his own, though he was still slightly outpaced. That would place base Luffy at around 60x the speed of Light by the end of the fight. But in Gear 4th, Snake Man, Luffy, and Katakuri were essentially equal in both speed and reaction, if not tilted slightly in Luffy's favor. So Snake Man Luffy at the time was likely operating at around 80x faster than Light, possibly even a bit more. This was one of Luffy's most important growth moments, and a massive leap in both skill and raw speed. Now for the moment everyone's been waiting for, the Wano arc. At the start of this arc, an enraged Luffy charges straight into battle with Kaido, thinking he had killed, or at the very least, seriously injured, his friends. But things don't go well. Even in Gear 4th, Luffy gets absolutely speed blitzed. Worse still, Kaido was drunk during this fight, and wasn't even using Future Sight. As I've said before, to truly speed blitz someone, you need to be at least 3 times faster than them. But before we scale Kaido, there's something important to consider. Luffy was furious during this fight, like blindingly angry. So it's questionable whether he was even capable of using Future Sight at that moment. That said, even without Future Sight, I highly doubt Luffy was still stuck at his Dressrosa levels. Katakuri pushed him to his absolute limits, and that growth carries forward. So I'd conservatively place Luffy at around 40x the speed of Light in Gear 4th without Future Sight. That would put drunk Kaido in this scene at a minimum of 120x faster than Light. And again, that's without Kaido taking the fight seriously yet. Later, in their next encounter, Luffy does use Future Sight. He's finally able to see Kaido's attacks coming, but he's still too slow to dodge them. Luffy was in base form at the time, so this version of Kaido was likely a bit faster than before. I'd estimate Kaido's speed here at around 150x the speed of Light, given that Luffy could perceive but not react in time. Eventually, Luffy realizes Kaido's true secret. He's been using Advanced Conqueror's haki the entire time. So Luffy pushes himself even further and learns to use it as well. And now, even in base, he can finally keep up with Kaido. That upgrade was massive. Luffy in base form with Advanced Conqueror's haki was now outperforming his earlier Gear 4th. So I'd estimate base Luffy at this point to be around 100x faster than light, even though he was still rough around the edges with this new power, which explains why, despite the leap, he still loses again. Much later, during their final battle, Luffy starts pulling out everything. All three advanced forms of haki. Gear, 4th, Snake Man. Gear 4th, Bound Man, and Kaido. He's drunk again, but now he starts to take Luffy seriously. He even starts using Future Sight himself. At this point, the fight likely crosses into 200x FTL territory, maybe even more, before Gear 5 enters the stage. And then it happens. Gear 5. This is where Kaido finally sees Luffy as a true threat. Both fighters go all out. Now, scaling this version of the fight is way more speculative. But based on how things played out, Luffy probably surpassed Kaido in speed, if I had to estimate. Gear 5. Luffy is likely operating somewhere between 250 to 500 times the speed of light. Personally, I lean toward the 300 to 400x range, but let's be honest. Gear 5 is absurd. It's such a massive jump from all his previous forms that trying to scale it perfectly is nearly impossible. And finally, we've reached the last arc we can use for Luffy's speed scaling, Egghead Island. Now, to be honest, there's not a lot here that significantly upscales Luffy's speed beyond what we've already established. But what we can do is clear the air on a few things. First off, let's address the obvious. Neither Luffy nor Kizaru was going all out during their fight in this arc. This is made crystal clear when Luffy lands a hit directly to Kizaru's head. If Luffy had used internal destruction haki, the fight would have ended right then and there. Kizaru would be dead. Second, I know some of you are itching to say that Luffy fighting Kizaru at all somehow disproves his faster-than-light scaling, but that argument has a few serious flaws. The most glaring issue? It completely ignores the fact that Kizaru has observation haki layered on top of his light-speed devil fruit, meaning his combat speed is already far above the speed of light. And beyond that, the series has explicitly shown Kizaru accelerating his light beams even further, indicating that he's capable of moving at multiple times light speed, not just baseline. So no, Luffy keeping up with Kizaru doesn't contradict anything. In fact, it confirms just how far he's come, because at this point he's standing toe-to-toe with a character who quite literally is light and beyond it. And that should wrap it up for this video. So, the final result? Luffy is operating anywhere between 250 to 500 times the speed of light by the end of the current story. That said, I do want to leave you with a few quick disclaimers. First, everything I scaled here is focused purely on combat and reaction speed, not travel or movement speed. Second, please don't take any of this as absolute fact. Only the author can give us definitive answers. This is just a well-researched interpretation. And finally, if I missed anything major or made a clear mistake, feel free to let me know in the comments, as long as you keep it respectful. Thank you so much for sticking around to the end. I really hope this video does well. I put a lot of time and effort into making it. Until next time, take care.